Welcome to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research virtually. My name is Alex Weiser. I'm the Director of Public Programs of YIVO. For those that don't know YIVO, it's a special place for the celebration and contemplation of Jewish history and Jewish culture. We have an archive and a library with over 23 million documents and over 400,000 books, which researchers and creative people and journalists use for their work all around the world. And in addition to making this material available to people, we have a variety of public programs like this, classes, exhibitions, and more, which bring the world to life and share it with everyone like you. So thank you so much for joining and for being a part of our learning community. So today we're gathering to discuss the new book, The Canvas and Other Stories by Salomea Perl, translated by Ruth Murphy. And we have Rokhl Kafrissen, who's a journalist and playwright in New York City, who's going to be moderating today's event. Rokhl's column in Tablet magazine began in 2017. It's called The Golden City, and you should check it out. It's an amazing column about Yiddish, all things Yiddish. You have to check it out. Ruth Murphy, the translator of this book, is a published and peer-reviewed professional translator specializing in the research and translation of Yiddish literature, historical documents, and Yizkor books. Justin Cammy is also joining us. Justin Cammy is chair and associate professor of Jewish studies and world literatures at Smith College. And finally, Anna Fishman Gonshor is faculty lecturer of Yiddish studies in the Department of Jewish Studies at McGill University, retired. And she's also one of the educators of our YIVO Uriel Weinreich summer program in Yiddish language, literature, and culture. So we're thrilled that she can join us for today's conversation as well. So thank you again, everyone, for joining. Thank you, everyone, for being a part of this panel. I'm going to hand it over to Rokhl.
Okay. Thank you, Alex, so much. And thank you to YIVO for making this possible. I am really so excited about this program. I think it's going to be so interesting and really very kind of unusual. So I don't usually speak off the cuff, but I'm going to do that now. I'm usually very over-prepared, so we're going to try something a little bit different. I'm going to be under-prepared and keep it super brief so that our panelists can speak. But I want to say that this panel or this program has a couple of elements that I, am very excited about. First of all, we have a superstar, brand new literary translator who has appeared kind of out of nowhere onto the Yiddish literary scene. And she went in a very short time from beginner Yiddish student to now published author of a really groundbreaking new volume in a beautiful bilingual edition. And in fact, I'm going to hold it up. This is it. So I just think that's so amazing. But what the book is also another thing that I really love, which is it has recovered, insofar as we know, the complete Yiddish, published Yiddish stories of an author named Salomea Perl. She published a novel in Polish, which we have and we know about. But these stories were mostly recovered and had not been republished since they appeared in newspapers in Poland when they were written. And also, we have some last-minute archival discoveries, perhaps even a bombshell, which we're going to talk about at the end of the program, which are very interesting. And again, may give us an opportunity to once again rewrite a little bit of the Yiddish literary history, which we thought was, kind of, there was nothing else to say, or maybe nothing else to be discovered or written. Also, one of the things we're doing is, since we couldn't find the image, I just want you guys to think about, if you're familiar with Yiddish literature, there's this image of the three klasikers, the dry klasikers, Mendele, Sholem Aleichem, and Peretz, the grandfather, the father, the son, and the Holy Trinity. And, as Justin Cammy is going to talk about it created this image or this idea of a Yiddish literary genealogy, and it was very much a self-conscious creation of Sholem Aleichem, and initiated their entry into the modern literary world. But of course, it's very odd when you think about it to have a family tree with no women on it. What kind of tree reproduces asexually? Well, I guess I don't know anything about botany. Maybe there are trees that reproduce asexually, but the point is that this created a certain kind of it created a context for how women were able to participate in this brand new and very exciting literary context. So we're going to be talking about this author, Salomea Perl. We have 7 incredible stories we're going to talk about. And I just want to give one last shout out to Larry Udelson at Ben Yehuda Press, who, you know, it's a small shop, and he's been doing some really fabulous work, and he made it possible for this beautiful, really, really beautiful and so well done bilingual edition, which is so perfect for people who are just starting to learn how to read Yiddish. If you want, it makes it so easy to really dive right into some exquisite texts. So with that said, I am going to invite Justin Cammy to do our introduction and to really do what he does so well, which is give us a little insight into the context of Yiddish Warsaw. Warsaw was the capital, the cultural capital of Yiddish land at this time. So the time, the place, the people, the relationships. Justin, take it away.
Thank you, Rokhl. It's so good to see how many colleagues of mine are out there, how many translators, and how many people are excited by this volume. It's also great for me to personally be here, not only with Rokhl, who was at Smith not so long ago virtually, but also with my friend and teacher, Anna Gonshor. And today, believe it or not, although I wrote the introduction to this volume, it's the first time I'm actually seeing Ruth Murphy. So in a way, it's a type of reunion of sorts. So and of course, I want to thank Evo. It's always good to be back at Evo, whether it be in person or virtually. Just this week, in fact, a few days ago, I got an email, as they happen out of nowhere, from Salomea Perl's grandniece. I haven't even told Ruth Murphy this yet.
Wow.
Hoping that she's joining us today, and I'll certainly send her more information. So I've been tasked to basically offer a brief introduction on Salomea Perl, and I want to suggest that maybe there's 3 different ways we can talk about her today. One might be horizontally, that is in terms of what's going on more broadly in fin de siècle Warsaw, which of course is a multilingual Jewish literary center, not only Yiddish and not only Polish, but also Hebrew, and how perhaps she and a number of other women writers are coming up at the same time as some of the names that are much more familiar. Then we might want to think of it, we could read vertically as part of this genealogy of Yiddish women fiction writers that perhaps challenges or displaces some of the familiar male genealogy that Rokhl was referring to. And then, of course, intersectionally, in 2 ways, perhaps, sort of where those 2 meet, the vertical and the horizontal axis, namely how reading Perl as a contemporary of Peretz or Sholem Aleichem as a reader of Perl might interrupt certain dominant narratives we have about this classical generation. And then the second way, not only essentializing her as a Yiddish woman writer, but really as a commentator on where class and gender intersect. And I think she does that really well. So in my introduction to this volume, one of the things that I talked about was how her stories offer these really intimate psychological portraits and socioeconomic sketches of a time where one's fate, especially as a woman, was determined through marriage. So in this title story, The Canvas, she writes at some point, her narrator says, "In my house, I felt like a stranger, like a prisoner, like someone bought and sold. But when she was in a room of her own, what the eye saw, the hand soon reproduced. I understood how to select colors, as does a painter, and under my hands, the canvas came alive." So to me, I think that this is really Perl using the character of a woman embroiderer, especially someone perhaps in a happy situation, dominated by parents, to really talk about her birth as a writer. It's very much a meta-literary way of describing what she sees herself doing. Because by the time Perl settles in Warsaw, she was adept enough in languages to support herself professionally as a translator. And I think it's always interesting to think of writers who are also translators, because translators are adept at interpreting the experiences of others for others, right? So here she has to take the experience that she had as a daughter of the shtetl, now sort of an educated woman in Warsaw who's a translator, and translate that much different shtetl environment for the modern Yiddish reader in a big city. But she begins, as many Jewish writers do at the time, not as a Yiddish writer, but as a writer in Polish. So though Warsaw was the largest Jewish city in Europe and the major center for the development and dissemination of modern Yiddish literature, and especially the press at that time, her fictional debut is not in Yiddish, but in the Polish Jewish language magazine Izraelita, where there were installments of this text from the diary of a young Jewish woman that appear. And it was not unusual for her or others to try their hand in other languages that were deemed to hold more status, whether that be in Polish for her, or in Russian for others, or in Hebrew for yet others. But let's talk a little bit about what she encountered in Warsaw, especially in the publishing world. Oftentimes her fate is yoked together with that of Peretz, who was undoubtedly familiar with her Polish writing, he being a fluent Yiddish Polish speaker. And the early 1890s were really known as Peretz's radical period. I know that Anna is going to talk a little bit more about this. And I think that this drew his attention because he invited Perl to contribute to his journal, Yontov Blättlich, and 3 of her stories appeared in the pages of this self-styled radical magazine in 1895 and 1896. The literary history tells us that they had a falling out. We don't know over what, but over the next decade and a half, only 4 more stories appeared in the Warsaw Yiddish press, not published by Parrots. That is in Der Jud, in the Jiddische Volkszeitung, and in Der Freund and Der Strahl. So the publication of Salomea Perl in Yiddish between 1891 and 1910 was really part of a growing, but I think still relatively limited trend among the male gatekeepers of Yiddish literature to provide room to women writers in the Yiddish press. This was a way for them to advertise their progressive credentials, not only as editors, but of the publications themselves, and also to open pages to new perspectives and obviously to potentially engage and enlarge their readerships, many of whom would have been women. So for instance, Mordechai Spechter's literary miscellany, Der Heusfreund, published 3 women writers in this period, not only his first wife, Bella Friedberg, who published under the pseudonym Isabella, but also Salomea Perl, and then Rokhl Kafrissen in 1899 and in 1901. Jenta Serdatsky's first short story appeared in Warsaw's Der Weg in 1905, exactly the same decade. A little bit further afield, Dvorah Baron published stories first in 1902, then in Yiddish in 1904. So she's part of an opportune moment in which the growth of Yiddish newspapers and journals, especially but not exclusively in Warsaw, expanded opportunities for women writers. And I like to think of this a little bit more deeply, because when we think of Der Yid, for instance, we're moving on from Peretz's Yontov Blättlich to the journal Der Yid, 1899 to 1902. This is a periodical that is edited by Ravnitsky, who is working with Bialik, and by Berkovich, who of course is Sholem Aleichem's son-in-law and translator into Hebrew. It's into this paper that Rokhl Kafrissen publishes 3 short stories. Then let's think of the Yiddish Volkszeitung, the weekly on Jewish affairs, which first appears in 1902, also with Mordechai Spechter as the literary editor. And we know how close the relationship was between Spechter and Sholem Aleichem. Spechter also was deeply involved in Heusfreund, which also publishes women writers at the same time. So when we think of people like Ravnitsky and Berkovich and Spechter and Sholem Aleichem and Peretz, we're talking about all of these writers who, these male writers who people from Anita Norwich to Naomi Seidman to many, many others have talked about as sort of exhibiting some of the sexual anxieties of what it would mean to, in a way, allow for more women's voices or a greater sensitivity to gender within Yiddish literature. That in some way, if that got too out of hand, perhaps that would contribute to the ideas, to the long-standing ideas that in some way Yiddish was really not an intellectual language or not up to par in comparison to Hebrew or other languages that attracted Jewish writers and readers. So there's this idea, this tension between wanting to include more voices, perhaps wanting to raise up some of these women writers, but at the same time, not allowing that to get too far afield that in some way their authority would be challenged. And I think Rokhl talked about this a little when she mentioned this genealogy that Sholem Aleichem sets up between himself as the grandson and Mendele as the grandfather. There's no grandmother, there's no mother. And we might want to ask, where would people like Serdatsky or Perl or Brochus fit into this genealogy that's forming at the very time? In her stories, I think we see a lot of interplay. I'm not going to talk about the interplay between Parrots and Perl so much to leave some room for Anna, but I'll talk about two with Sholem Aleichem. In one of the stories that Perl writes about Rivka, the poor woman who rushes off to the rabbi to inquire about a slaughtered hen, is this not Sholem Aleichem's Das Teppel? And does this not come out several years before Sholem Aleichem's Das Teppel? And in the story where we have the exchange of letters between Genendel and Michal, the story Seeking Bread, is this not a wife's longing for an absent husband and a husband's desperate search for work in the big city, something that anticipates Sholem Aleicham's Menachem Mendel and Shena Shendel exchanges? So it's not, I think we can be even more radical today, Rokhl, saying that some of the very texts that are the most canonical texts by Sholem Aleichem, at least, were perhaps influenced, if not ripped off, from Salomea Perl, since she comes earlier in doing some of these things. Finally, I just want to note how great a moment we're in terms of translation of Yiddish women's literature. We could go back to the translation of Chava Rosenfarb's Tree of Life in '85, and Bocciani, and of Lodge and Love, and Survivors, and of course Esther Kreitman has been well translated. But just the moment that we're in the past few years, seeing Kadya Molodowski, Rocco Feigenberg, Bluma Lempel, Yenta Mash, Miriam Karpilova, and now Salomea Perl, tells us that I think we're at an inflection point where we are going to need to reread not only later histories of Yiddish literature, but especially sort of this period that we refer to as the classical generation. I'll end there and open it up.
That was absolutely perfect timing. So thank you, Justin. And you brought up a lot of questions and a lot of avenues for us to discuss. So I'm looking forward to our conversation at the end. And so now we're going to bring on Anna Gonshor, who is, I consider, a teacher of mine. And
weren't you going to have Ruth first?
Oh, sorry. I'm already like, I got so excited. I got carried away.
She can go first. She can go next.
We're going to have Ruth Murphy. She is our translator and my, new hero going from absolute beginner to superstar translator. Wow, what a journey. And you're speaking to us from Florida, Ruth?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. So first of all, I think a lot of people are going to be wondering, since these stories are just now being brought together, published, and being brought back to light after so long, after over 100 years. Can you talk a little bit first about what your journey was to discovering her as a writer and then collecting all the stories that can be found today?
Well, what happened was that the Pack and Traeger put out their yearly call for translations, and they wanted women writers. So I did a Google search on Yiddish women writers, and I put newspaper because it had to be in the papers. And I came up with Norit Orchan's article about women in the Yiddish press, which is a great article. And I saw Salomea Perl. She gave a couple women's names, and I was able to find their stories through the historical press that's online, thank goodness. And I found Sipki, and
where?
The Jewish historical press that's online.
Okay.
If I'm saying it right. And I found Sipki, and it was I never read a story like that, and I never seen Yiddish like that. It's the Yiddish that I really liked. And then I found Patki, and that was it, hooked. I had to have the rest of these stories, and it was just a matter of, I had Raiden's lexicon, and he told me more or less sometimes more or less where they were. He got the titles more or less right. And it took about 2 years and a few $100s. I was working from Killeen, Texas, so I was doing everything online, and I found 3 of the stories myself. Potki, Sipki, and Dostoyevsky I was able to find, and then 2 of the other stories I hired an intern through YIVO, actually found them. They were in the YIVO archives, thank goodness for YIVO. And then the last 2 stories, Broit Zuchendik and Onkinder, I could not find anywhere. We knew they were in Peretz Blättlech, but however they put these things together, I don't know, I don't understand. But I mean, we found lots of Peretz Blättlech, but we could not find whichever one it was that had these stories on. And they finally called the YIVO and talked to Dr. Ludmila Sholokhova, who was the director of archives there, and it's like, I cannot find these stories. I'm desperate. I need, I was upset. And she put me on hold and, came back about 4 minutes later and it's like, yes, I have found your stories for you. So, I mean, she knows the collection that well. And so I got my last 2 stories, and always knew I wanted to be bilingual, because to me, the star of the show, it's not the translations, it's the Yiddish. I mean, she does, as a translator, you have to look at how the language is being used. As a writer too, that. She just uses Yiddish so beautifully. I mean, I wish I could speak. I had that mastery of the language, especially as a short story writer. You really have to be able to nail that.
Yeah.
And to me, the star of the show is her Yiddish. It's incredible.
So do we know, or is it possible to know she wrote under any pseudonyms? Because a lot of Yiddish writers at the time did.
Not that I've seen so far, but who knows?
Yeah.
Not that I've seen so far.
Well, so that's sort of possibly an open question mark for further research, and that's again,
unless Salomea is. Sorry, I interrupted you.
Oh no, that's okay. I thought we know that's her name. That is her real name, no? Well, again, it's funny. One of those things when you enter into Yiddish literature is you discover how kind of elusive real names really are, because so many of them had, not just 1, not just 2, but 10.
There's some discussion, was it Sora, but we've not been able to find a birth certificate or a marriage certificate, so it's not definitive.
Okay, so it's a modern story, because this kind of research from deep in Texas couldn't have been done 15 years ago, when we didn't have all these Yiddish newspapers digitized on the Jewish Historical Press website through the National Library of Israel. So I was hoping that now, as you kind of hinted at as you were just finishing, you could talk a little bit about your insight into the text as the translator. And it's funny, I just want to say, and then I'll let you talk, that as I was going back to the book, and I was thinking, yes, like her style is really beautiful, but at the same time, here's this woman who went to finishing school, or she went to school in Switzerland, and I think of her as very elegant and refined, but she has people speak in a very earthy way. They're cursing at each other. They're really like laying in, and they're not holding back anything, right? And that's also very interesting as a student of Yiddish, to read what you imagine this is the way people actually talked. But I'd like you to talk a little bit about her language and what struck you about the way she uses Yiddish in the text.
Well, number one, that it was so colloquial. The stories are almost completely dialogue. One of them is letters, so it's all dialogue. And it made it very hard to translate, because I'm not a native speaker. I don't know how to use the language that way. And some of the lines were...
it's very tricky.
It was very tricky, and I'm not 100% sure I got it right. Reina Mezuzela, who I could not find that one anywhere. We just made a guess. Officia, I mean, there's words in there we're not 100% sure on, and maybe some of the people who read it will finally give us a clue. I do think her use of narrative was really interesting, and this is actually something that Sheva Zucker thought of, not me, but it's so stark. And like you said, she was very educated, but there's no the very little bit of narration that there is, it's extremely just, if you look at the opening of Sipki, it's like, this is what she looked like, this is what happened to her. But it gives you, because of the description, she just describes how she looks, and then she describes that the butcher drags her by her hair to the ground. And that just tells you a lot about Sipki, about her life. I mean, it's obvious she's had a rough life. It's obvious she has no one. And it's obvious that she is brutalized probably all the time. And I do think it's interesting, a point that Dr. Cammy made, that Die Kanve was the only story written in first person narrative, the only one. And I also think that that is in some way Perl's story, her narrative. And we know from Boris Zukendiek, we know Mechoy and Genendel, we know them only through their letters. The character Rivka from Und Kinder, with childless, we have no description of her at all, nothing. We know her only through her thoughts and her speech, yet we know her so well, and I love her, I do. That character really went to my heart. And what happened to her was heartbreaking. But I mean, she does so little, but I remember my teacher said one time, he said that, Norman Buder said that she did a lot with very little. And we have the recurring theme of childlessness, which is brought up. It's an issue, obviously, for Rivka. Golda has no children. Genendel has no children. Malka has no children, but she's still young. And it shows up in Sipki in kind of an odd way, because Sipki's not married, so she's not worried about having children. But you do have the scene when she's in the kitchen where Shmuel, with the crying baby, wanting to nurse him. And there's, the comment about her Dara eingefallen Brust, her thin sunken chest, that she's not had children. And I mean, it's kind of broadened that way. And I think the things that make the stories in a way so hard to read, because they're so sad and stark, some of them, and this is a recurring theme to all the stories, is that I feel as a social critique, like Dr. Cammy said, is the fact that no one had any choices. Not just the women, but the men as well. I mean, Golda had no choice but to get married. We know that in the Canva, but the men didn't either. In Dos Theater, we have Malka's husband, who's a young guy, and he's been in a marriage that he probably didn't want, and is in a life which he is he keeps saying it's choking him, it's suffocating him.
Yeah. So
the men, and I feel like a story that doesn't get a lot of attention, but it's a really interesting story, is Potki mit the Bremen. I mean, Potki he's on the absolute lowest level of society. He's an absolute pauper. No one knows where he came from. In a lot of ways, he kind of parallels the character Golda, in the sense that from Die Kanve, because he also he's in a fantasy world. He sees himself as a householder, and he too has things to do, and he has a business, and which is, I mean, he lives in a hovel that it doesn't even have a roof or busted out windows. I mean, he lives in a horrible place. Mm-hmm. But he has this whole fantasy constructed about who he is actually, and it all comes crashing down, like it did with Golda, in a really harsh way. But it's the poverty. There's no choice. The poverty doesn't leave him choices, and you get the feeling from the story, also from Sipke and from Potki, and also from Broit Zuchendiek, the disdain and the contempt that all these characters receive, not only from their their employers, but from the town. I mean, in Sipke, she's mocked by the servant girls. No one will let her get near the well. People give Genendel a hard time. Oh, your husband left you. He's with other women. Yeah. She says that they don't miss an opportunity to try and hurt me. And in Potki, you get the feeling that they all need him to stay exactly where he is, because he's the guy, he's like their version of the untouchable, mm-hmm. Where he's the guy who does all the stuff nobody else wants to do. And they treat him and his wife horribly. So
Yeah, I want to bring something out here. I think that's so interesting because at the beginning we were thinking about genealogies, literal, familial, literary, and it's interesting that the important fact about him is that nobody knows where he came from, or they claim they don't know. Who knows? But look, this is a place where yichus really mattered, right? So the insistence that he in fact has no yichus, he has no provenance, is really important.
Yeah.
And that's why he says, why am I the worst one? The beggars and paupers from the poorhouse are preferable to me. Nothing is owed to me. Certainly I deserve 10 times as much. Nobody's going to give him that. And they're making sure by keeping him, on yichus, without any kind of yichus, without provenance.
But what is that at the end, Rokhl? What does he say at the end? Look at the end of that story. That's the kicker.
Yeah, I mean, that's his fantasy too.
Oh,
The
yeah.
kicker.
I have letters from rabbis. I will show them. And you have to think that here's Salomea Perl, also somebody who is so relative to her characters, so privileged. She's gone to Switzerland. She is educated. She has
yichus.
Yet she chooses, one thinks, to use these characters in a way, I don't know, what do you think, to talk about her own condition and her own choices?
I'm not sure. I think that she was commenting, she was a super intelligent person, and rather than kind of being within her social sphere and not deigning to look around her, that she looked around, saw the world around her and saw what was happening, and this is just my guess, didn't like it. It wasn't fair, it wasn't right. It was hypocritical. Yeah, and I'm sure she knew a lot of Sipkis and a lot of Putkis, and and how certainly she was in the same judgment that all women were, that you had to have children and get married, and she wasn't free from that either. So
right. And just one more thing, and then we're going to move on to Anna. I love that you brought up the theater, because reading that, you expected to hate David, the husband, right? That here's this woman at the beginning, we're so worried that he's out at the theater every night. He's abandoning her. Her parents are going to beat him up. He's a no good Nick. And then, there's this incredible, knip, like, oh, wait a second. We feel so strongly for him. And in fact, at the end, she and her husband come together and realize perhaps the theater is a space for both of them to express themselves, widen their horizons. It's like,
he was a good kid.
What?
Said he was a good kid.
They
were both kids.
He wasn't the villain. He was not
at all.
So we're gonna pause there, and now we're gonna move on to Anna. Sorry, I really jumped the gun on that one.
Okay.
I'm excited, but I wanted to say that I knew immediately that I wanted Anna for this program because I have learned with her at Clas Canada, and her sensitive readings. It sounds so corny, but it's true. Like, she has always made me see Parrots in ways that nobody else has made me see his stories. Learning Parrots with her is just such a joy and a pleasure. So I'm hoping Anna will open up a little bit and help us think about what the texts, what both Peretz's texts and Salomea Perl's short stories might be able to tell us about this relationship, of which we have very little other textual evidence.
Right. So thank you, Rokhl, for those lovely words, and thank you for the invitation. And I'm thrilled to be here. I'm honored to be here with Justin and Ruth. I don't know what kind of medal to give you, but you have really done us such an incredible service, not only in uncovering the stories, but in the beautiful way that you presented it in the bilingual edition. It is aesthetically beautiful and so important. And just in your introduction to the book is wonderful. Really, really, oyster cushion. I want to say a few things. First of all, Peretz coined the term the double oppression of the Jewish woman. And I think this is the rubric under which I want to look at these stories. No, even before I go there, I want to say that when Rokhl asked me to look at the stories, I was smitten. I was smitten by Salomea's language.
Yeah.
Her language is so rich. It's the Lashon Kodesh content is exceptionally good and appropriate. Her curses are fabulous. It's for the language itself. This is a major, major gift. So let's go back to the double oppression of the Jewish woman. And what does Peretz mean by that? Justin, as you said, the situation, the economic situation and the social situation where the woman was forced into a position of being the economic backbone on the one hand, and having also to maintain whatever home from a hovel to a palace, and everything in between. And not having, of course, any male support in any of this. And on the other hand, there is no recognition of her within the Jewish tradition. The poorest job of a man can get an aliyah in shul, and he will be called up as Reb. There is nothing in traditional Jewish life to honor the woman. There is nothing in the way most traditional Jewish women were raised to honor them in terms of Jewish education, Jewish knowledge. It was limited, and therefore they were victim to the superstition that prevailed. And we have that in Salomea's stories, we have that in other writers' stories, in Dvorah Baron, and we have it in spades in Peretz's stories. So if we look, Peretz started his Yiddish career with Monish in 1888, and in a few years, by 1891 to the beginning of the early years of the 20th century, he is producing at least a dozen or more stories of Jewish women. And what's interesting about those stories is he sees the Jewish woman as in a role of wife, mother, daughter, sister, but each one has different characteristics within those categories. You have the passive wife, you have the aggressive wife, you have the kind friend, you have the friend who subverts, you have the devoted sister, you have the sister that runs away. You have all of these women, and his language in their description belies his maleness in his ability to get into the heart and soul and the kishkes and the agony and the love and the anger and all of those emotions that women experience in these different situations. It's there. Ruth, you mentioned Salome's lack of detailed description, right? We get the here's Sipki. Well, here's Haim the porter in Sholem Aleichem. Do we know anything about him? No. And here's what happens to him, right? So what do we know about Bunche? What do we know about Bunche Schweig? Look at Sipki, 1910. Bunche Schweig was written in 1894. tell me Sipki isn't Bonche Schweig.
Right.
So in each one of these stories, I didn't start out looking for this, but as I read Sipki, I saw Bonche, and then that scene, Ruth, that you mentioned, where she's standing at the cradle and rocking with the baby with one foot. She's got the stove going. She's got Yosele, who, by the way, is Haim and Chana's son's name, also from Sholem Aleichem. And she's rocking the baby. And I said, oh my God, that's a description of Chana when Haim comes home in Sholem Aleichem. You know, he runs home to give her money, and she hasn't got time for him because she says, I'm standing at the stove and I'm rocking the baby, and I'm saying, wait a minute, you know, wait a minute. And then look at the end of Sipki. Look at how the story ends. Shmerel, the old yeshiva bocher, who's also mocked. He's a nobody in the community, right? And what does he do at the end? He elevates Sipki, right? He honors her. This lowly man, he elevates her to a human, womanly position. What does Haim do at the end of Sholem Aleichem? Haim, the porter, who cannot even make Kiddush, who knows nothing of Jewish ritual. What does he do at the end when he is told by his Rebbe that, you know what, you'll earn Olam Haba by carrying water to the scholars, and in their merit you'll earn Olam Haba, and if you have Olam Haba, your wife will be your footstool. And Haim walks in to the little attic apartment, and there's his wife sitting and reading. She's ritually competent. She's sitting and reading Gott von Avram, and he looks at her, and his love for her says, no, Hannah, you will not be my footstool. And then he says, you know, and you, God, you're going to have to take it. So here we have these two stories where these lowly figures, both poverty-stricken, impoverished, berated, whatever, but their humanity is expressed so beautifully and is elevated and elevates them and their partners in an incredibly powerful way. So so the question is, Peretz encouraged her to move from Polish to Yiddish in 1895, right? And then within that year, he publishes 3 of her stories. And those 3 stories, On Kinder, Bräut suchen, and the theater, those stories are so closely linked to Peretz's stories. The 1895 Bräut suchen, which is Salomea's work of letters between a husband and wife in Poland, who the husband goes off to try and earn a living. And the correspondence between them is exactly at the same time as Peretz's damning story, Ha'isha Moritz Chana. And in this story, the man leaves for America without telling his wife, and the letters are between this wife and her brother who robbed her of her inheritance. and the husband in America who is now becoming less and less of a Jew. And the differences in these two stories are incredible, because what Salome does in these stories of Broitsuchen, where the husband goes to look for bread, the love and respect that's expressed between these two, and she can't write her own letter. She has a letter writer write for them. And you see in the beginning, the formalized address that the letter writer uses, that eventually changes, to the more intimate. And what they will do for each other, and her concern for him, that, she says, he writes about how difficult it is in Warsaw, and how difficult it is to find a way to make a living. And she says, well, just stay healthy, and I'll come to you. And she says, I hear that sausages are very reasonable in Warsaw. Make sure you eat at least one a day, but make sure it's fresh. Her devotion to him and her love. And in the other, you see how the shtetl consumed its inhabitants. And the way out was not easy. And in this case, going to America was a choice that he made. This is Peretz's story. Peretz was tough. Peretz says, you can't do nothing. You've got to do something. And he abrogates his responsibility. He runs away. And this poor woman, Hannah, who is trying so desperately, but again, she is helpless. She is not helping herself either. She is allowing herself to be trapped by her brother and his wife. And in the end, she goes crazy. She loses a child, doesn't tell the husband. It's a horrible story, but it's all conducted through these letters. So you have these two simultaneous stories in 1895, one by Salome and one by Peretz, and they're incredible. Again, the language in both of them, very powerful, very forceful, very empowering to in Salome's side, and very, very dehumanizing in Peretz's. I think I'm going to stop, because, like I said to Justin, I said we could do a whole course on this.
And we have a couple minutes left.
But it's truly incredible. He has so again, this Heiko Latnik story again is very, which is 1903, is very, very evocative of Sholem Bias. Very evocative of Sholem Bias. So the question is, what kind of conversations did Peretz and Salomea actually have about her writing? And was he ready to support her? Was he ready to encourage her? Was he ready to help her career? If this is her writing without anyone's help, she didn't need help. Her writing is unbelievable.
Surely if he was publishing her, he was editing her too, right?
Yes. But the others, if these stories are written by her hand alone, I mean, yes, every writer has an editor. The best writers have editors. The question is, what were their conversations? What was Peretz's interest in promoting her? How was he going to be able to use her writing in his agenda? Because he had an agenda, right? He had an agenda. There's no question about it. Yeah.
I was going to say that it sounds like you're making an argument for, or at least filling in the missing gap on the breakup between Peretz and Salomea. That what starts out as a mentoring relationship, he quickly discovers that she becomes the competitor.
I think so.
No longer a mentoring relationship. She's so. As good and Absolutely. Takes things in a very different direction that is even starker in some ways, more naturalistic in other ways.
In some ways, yes.
More human and more humanizing, as you say, in other ways. So that, since I'm the only man on the panel, I can say that from a man's perspective, certainly one with his ego, that may not have been something that he was comfortable dealing with.
I agree. I agree. But look, I think we have to be really careful about speculating. But wouldn't it be fun to do?
All right, so we only have a couple minutes, and there's still a lot I would like to cover. I mean, there's so many intriguing. First of all, just to wrap up what Anna has been saying, there's so many intriguing things in the texts of both Peretz and Perl, that in Peretz you have the figure of the water carrier. The male water carrier is, so lowly, but can elevate himself by serving the scholars. But in Sipki, becoming a water carrier is the last step in her dehumanization. Mm-hmm. There is nowhere to go from there. And what does that mean, right? Like, I think that shows that Salomea Perl used that, in fact, is even more, she's more able to get into the sort of disturbing point of view of what it meant to be a woman, which is that there was no redemption from being dehumanized by the community by saying, okay, you're like an animal now, you're going to be a water carrier. And she couldn't say no.
And she couldn't say no. And again, her redemption was through him.
Comes from outside, comes from a man's actions.
Right.
So, what I want to do, maybe you guys will find this useful question, and I think that, Justin, you brought this up at the beginning, this question of if we were going to kind of imaginatively rewrite these literary genealogies of influence, and kind of write her back into conversation, perhaps, with her contemporaries, what has this sparked within you in terms of thinking about those relationships? What might that look like?
Not pretty.
Is that an interesting question? If anybody wants to take a stab at that, that's staying with the sort of thinking about the literary texts. But I also want to get to this question, or not this question, but this incredible discovery that was made recently, which is that the lexicon of Yiddish literature says that Salomea Perl died in 1916, and that's what's written in this volume. Well, it turns out that we now have evidence, because she was writing letters to newspapers, apparently as least as late as 1930. And Ruth, did you want to talk a little bit, just give the audience a sort of summary of the developments that have happened, like really, really super recently?
I'm probably going to get them mixed up, but I'm going to try. The lexicon gives no birth, no date of death, which maybe now we know was because she was alive. But in Yankov Shatsky's Geschichte von Jiden in Warsaw, that's where you see the 1916 date. And it gets, when Dr. Zucker sent out her announcement for our talk that we had on Sunday, the reading of the book, a former YIVO student, Piotr Nazarek, sorry for massacring your name, he decided to do some research on Perl, and we know that she was alive definitely as late as 1928, I believe 1930, if what we found was correct. We're like finding all these things in Polish and then sending them to somebody who actually reads Polish, so we know that we actually know what we're talking about. My daughter-in-law has been doing lots of research, so thank you, Lindsay, you're amazing. So we think she was alive as late as 1930. We still don't have a date of death. Still don't have any sort of merit certificate. Maybe she was named Sora. There was somebody named Sora. We know from somebody finding her father's, from Piotr, I believe, finding her, and Shalom Leaf also, her father's tombstone, that it says that he had 2 daughters and a son. So, and I believe that there was one child named Maja who I think died very young, maybe like 1880 something, but it was young. So it's just, it's a lot of stuff and we're still putting it together, but the long and short of it is that she was still alive in 1930 and still not found a death certificate, which doesn't bode well, but nobody wants to go there, so I won't.
Well, let me say a couple things. First of all, when Ruth and I were talking about this, even though I said, let's not go there, but I went there and I did look on the Yad Vashem database to see if she was listed, and
She's not.
she's not. So,
She's not.
you know, who knows? What I thought was really interesting is that one of the pieces of evidence or text that Piotr came across was that she wrote to a newspaper in defense of Lucian Peretz years after Lucian Peretz was Yud Lamed Peretz's son, who apparently died not long after his father. And apparently there was some kind of scandal. I don't know if either of you know.
15 years later?
I don't know. But what's interesting is that even though we think that there was some kind of, you know, broigus between Salomea Perl and Peretz, all these years later, she's writing to a newspaper to defend his reputation, which is quite interesting. And this is interesting to me that, you know, we don't talk enough about the what is involved in this kind of research. So to me, it shows that Salomea Perl, like Parrots, there's still so much research to be done. And the thing is that research is actually not in Yiddish, it's in Polish. And there, you know, speaking of pseudonyms, you know, Parrots, who wrote copiously for the press, both Yiddish and Polish, and as my understanding is that there is an incredible amount of his writing under, you know, countless of his pseudonyms that are still out there. They're not translated into English. They're not, you know, they haven't been collected or republished. So, I mean, and we're talking about, you know, one of the 3 people on our Yiddish literary genealogy, and even there's still these very, very essential pieces of research that have not been done. So with somebody like Salomea Perl, who we assume has a much smaller body of work, still that is waiting to be done, to go into the Polish language newspaper archives and to look and to figure out, did she have a pseudonym? I mean, I think surely writing as a woman, she must have. She must have.
You know, Rokhl, part of the story here is that we need to remember that each one of these writers was multilingual. You know, we right. Put them in our Yiddish box and forget that they were multilingual, having access to the press in other languages, knowing the literatures of the nations around them. You know, so that there is a whole life of creativity that we need to find in those other languages, because they did write in those other languages, even when they chose Yiddish.
I want to read a comment here. Nomi Jones just commented that it's similar to the mythology around Friedel Stuck, that apparently her actual date of death has just been ascertained, and it's much later than was previously believed. And she writes, somehow when women stop writing, we declare them dead.
Yeah. So I was going to say that maybe since she began as a Polish writer and then moved to Yiddish, the question for me is why did she stop writing in Yiddish, if she did? And I'm not convinced that these stories are necessarily the only ones out there. So I'd be happy to be proven wrong. The second issue is, you know, was there a turn back to Polish between her last Yiddish story and 1930? And maybe this, I mean, it's always important to understand genealogies and dates of, I'm more interested in her as a writer necessarily than how or where she died, but I'm hoping that Professor Shaban in Warsaw won't mind, given that we have all these new finds that we've had, that this email that I literally received 2 days ago, out of the blue, which said, I recently received this book. So this is a credit to you, Ruth, by Salomea Perl. She was the sister of my grandfather, David. So here we have an answer to, one of the sibling questions.
Wow.
One of the things that she discovers from her family tree is that any information she could discover was mostly from the male, the patrilineal line, the forefathers of her father, who's Tadeusz Perl. So among them is Kalman Avigdor, who of course is the father of Salomea and David. So we have a little bit of information, but I think your point, Anna, is wonderful and shows why it's so important that we continue to support that community of fluent Polish speakers who are interested in Yiddish and who realize that to do the literary archaeology of a multilingual, expansive and inclusive Polish literature means also knowing Yiddish.
Yes.
Right? In the same way that our ability to do an inclusive grand history of Jewish literature means knowing Yiddish and Hebrew and Ladino and other languages, big and small. So to me, she's representative of something much, much larger. And I think the one thing that I would end on is how wonderful she is at this archaeology of culture. I mentioned class at the beginning, and in Putki with the eyebrows, I keep coming back to this idea that it's the guys, and of course we know this, that it's one of his ways of earning a living is to rap on the shutters in order to wake people up for Shacharis in the morning. But what I didn't know is that, of course, this needed to be compensated. And one of the ways that it was compensated was to visit each family that you do this for in order to wait for, a kopek or two. And when a family doesn't give him what he deserves on the eve of Shabbos, what does he do? The only thing that's within his power, he takes their challah, so they won't have challah for Shabbos. I mean, that's all that's left that he has in terms of power. So that these sort of snippets of a window into this world, and also the wonderful way at the moment when the shtetl is already in the process of being mythologized as the meta-poetic, sort of the only meta-poetic place that Jews really have of their own, she's already deconstructing this and showing what we already know, these huge class divisions that are simply tearing the Jewish community apart. This idea of community, of wholesomeness, didn't exist, never existed, and here, clearly wouldn't exist.
Nicht gesteugen, nicht geflogen.
Yeah. The image of Sipki clucking like an animal is so haunting to me.
Right.
That, here we're supposed to think that the Jewish woman was, revered and she's an Ashes Chayil. This woman is clucking like an animal because she has no words. She's allowed no words. It's so haunting. I want to read a comment from, again, from the chat. Lindsay O'Connor says there's one entry in the dictionary of the pseudonyms of Polish writers, and it says Sal.P equals Perl Salomea. So
that's my daughter-in-law.
Oh, so
She's amazing.
That's very intriguing to me. And it says, hey, grad students out there, like there's some really interesting, important, avenues, untrodden paths for you to go down. You just need to go learn Polish and Yiddish, and you'll be
Russian. Russian would be good.
And I want to give a shout out to Piotr Nazaruk, one of our students from Evo, who did some wonderful digging and sent us that.
Fantastic. Amazing what he could find. Some of this stuff is just there on the surface waiting to be found. I mean, that's obvious. What it's waiting for is people to ask the right questions. So it's past 2. I don't think we actually have any questions. Unfortunately, we have a question here. Will there be any reading of Perl's work in today's program, Bilingual Learn English? I'm sorry, Judy Freeman, that actually happened on Sunday. That specific program that you're looking for happened, but I think it may be online.
It's on YouTube. It's on YouTube.
So go to YouTube. It's a League for Yiddish event. You should go and see that. Sunny Katz writes, Perl is way ahead of her time, would contribute greatly to feminism today. Well, you know what? She's with us. So she is contributing to our revision and our deepening understanding of Yiddish literature, which I thank her for, and I thank Ruth for. Somebody writes, oh, this is interesting. She spent time in Paris before 1908. She could have published there. And that's, certainly she could have. That's a really intriguing thought. So if the panelists have any last comments they'd like to give, this is your moment, or I'm going to wrap things up.
I wanted to thank everybody for coming and for everybody who's given the book a chance. I really appreciate it. And I hope you enjoy it.
Well,
and thank you to
bravo, Ruth. Bravo.
Oh.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
And I would say to Ruth, thank you again for doing this and giving this to the world of readers interested in Yiddish literature and Jewish literature writ large. I would say that the best thing we could do, not only for Ruth, but for all of these translators who are bringing more works that had never been known to the surface, is not only to buy the books. Don't wait for photocopies, right? Buy the books. This one's really not that expensive. And for those of us who are students and teachers, to teach these books. So I'm going to be
on
teaching
my curriculum for the summer.
So I'll be teaching a couple of stories at the Yiddish Book Center and in Tel Aviv this summer. And to the extent that we can have people reading and commenting,
right, that'll
be wonderful.
Yeah. Okay. This is so exciting. Thank you. Like, honestly, just for me to be here chatting with you brilliant people, like, what a machaya. Okay.
You're the brilliant one, Rokhl.
Right.
Yesterday, by the way, yesterday was the 4th anniversary of my column. So,
Mazel tov. Mazel tov.
It's such a delight to be here with you guys and to feel connected again. So thank you to everybody who came, and thank you to Alex and to Jane for making this happen. And I really look forward to seeing all of you again, whether virtually or in person very soon.
Thank you so much, Rokhl.
Thank you.
And Dr. Cammy.
Bye, everyone. Take care.
Bye-bye.